The radio crackled with static, then nothing. For 3 hours and 17 minutes, the Joint Operations Center at Bagram Airfield heard only silence where Callsign Reaper 6 should have been. Controllers exchanged glances across glowing screens, their fingers hovering over keyboards, reluctant to type the words that would make it official. Outside, the Afghan sun blazed against the Hindu Kush, indifferent to the 23 souls waiting for a voice that refused to come. Major Alina Kovac had launched at 0500 in an A-10C Thunderbolt II, the ungainly warthog that everyone said flew like a bathtub with anger issues. Her mission was close air support for a surrounded Marine reconnaissance team in the Korangal Valley, that merciless stretch of terrain where mountains ate helicopters and Taliban fighters knew every stone by name. The last transmission had been clipped, professional, Reaper 6, Winchester on 30 mic, taking ground fire, continuing support. Then the frequency died like someone had cut a wire. The Marines on the ground had stopped calling. That was worse than the silence from above. In the TOC, a young airman first class kept adjusting his headset, as if the problem was his equipment and not the possibility that somewhere in those ancient valleys, wreckage was still smoking. The operations officer, a lieutenant colonel with shadows under his eyes, stood behind the controllers with his arms crossed. He had been in this room before when pilots didn't come home. He knew how the next hours would unfold. The search and rescue alert, the grim notifications, the way everyone would speak in past tense by midnight. But Alina Kovac was not wreckage, not yet. She had joined the Air Force 17 years ago from a family that knew nothing about flying, the daughter of Croatian immigrants who ran a bakery in Cleveland, and thought the military was something other people's children did. She had paid for flight school herself, working nights at the bakery, showing up to ground school smelling faintly of bread and exhaustion. The instructors had been skeptical, not because she was a woman, they insisted, but because she was quiet, small-framed, the kind of person who blended into walls at parties. They could not see what drove her, the way she studied aircraft performance manuals like scripture, how she flew simulators past midnight until her hands remembered every switch without thinking. She had earned her wings through sheer refusal to fail, then chosen the A-10, that ugly angel of the close air support world, because everyone else wanted fast jets and glory. Alina wanted to be useful. She wanted to matter. Now, somewhere above or below the mountains, she was either proving that choice right or paying for it with her life. The radio stayed silent. The clock kept counting. They had given her the Callsign Reaper 6 during her second deployment, after a mission where she had stayed on station for 6 hours beyond her fuel capacity, cycling through refueling tracks 3 times, refusing to leave until an army patrol had made it back inside the wire. Someone in the squadron had meant it as mockery. She was too dedicated, too serious, always volunteering for the dangerous slots that others tried to avoid. But the name stuck differently than intended. Soldiers started requesting her by call sign. They trusted Reaper 6 because she always came, always stayed, always fired her cannon with surgical precision that kept danger close without crossing the line into friendly fire. The Marines in the Korangal had requested her specifically. Their team leader, a gunnery sergeant named Rios, had worked with her before, and when the mission brief came through showing their insertion point in a valley bowl with only one exit, he had asked for the pilot who would not leave them behind. Alina had read the brief 3 times, studied the terrain elevation maps, calculated fuel consumption down to the minute, and accepted without hesitation. The A-10 was built for this. Low, slow, lethal, able to take punishment that would shred anything else in the inventory. She had walked to the aircraft in pre-dawn darkness, helmet bag slung over her shoulder, ignoring the looks from the F-16 pilots who still treated the A-10 community like a flying museum. Her crew chief, a technical sergeant named Martinez with 2 decades of wrenching on warthogs, had done the pre-flight inspection personally. He trusted the bird, but he trusted Alina more, and he wanted both of them back. She had climbed into the cockpit, strapped into the ejection seat with the efficiency of ritual, and begun the start sequence, while the twin General Electric turbofans wound up with their distinctive whistle roar. The flight north had been routine until it wasn't. The Marines had made contact with a larger force than intelligence had predicted, and suddenly routine had transformed into desperation. Alina had arrived over the valley to find tracers rising like deadly fireworks, the Marines compressed into a rocky outcrop with enemy fighters closing from 3 directions. She had rolled in for her first gun run at 400 feet, the GAU-8 Avenger cannon spitting 70 rounds per second of 30mm hate, walking the impacts across enemy positions with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Then the sky had opened up with anti-aircraft fire, and everything changed. The AAA came from positions the intelligence brief had missed, Russian-made Zu-23 guns that filled the air with copper-jacketed death. Alina had felt the impacts before she heard them, metal hammering into titanium, the airframe shuddering like something alive and wounded. Warning lights bloomed across her panel, hydraulic pressure dropping in the port system, engine temperature rising on number 2, flight control degradation. She could have broken off, climbed out, called for someone else to take the mission. Instead, she had keyed the radio, Reaper 6 continuing, and rolled in for another pass. The Marines below had seen the smoke trailing from her aircraft, seen her turn back toward the guns that had just torn into her, and something had shifted in their understanding of what courage looked like. Alina had made 4 more runs, switching to her remaining ordnance, dropping Mk-82 bombs with ripple-fire precision that collapsed the ridgeline the enemy was using for cover. Her aircraft had been disintegrating incrementally, each pass costing her another system, but she had stayed until the Marine gunny was screaming into the radio for her to get out, that they could hold now, that she had given them enough. She had pulled off target trailing black smoke from both engines, though limping through the air like a wounded bird still refusing to fall. That was when she had made her final transmission and then gone silent, disappearing into the vastness of the Afghan sky with a plane that should not still be flying. In the TOC, the lieutenant colonel had begun drafting the casualty report. The controllers had stopped hopping and started grieving. The young airman with the headset had finally taken it off, unwilling to hear static anymore. Then, like a ghost signal bleeding through interference, the radio sparked to life. Bagram Tower, Reaper 6. The voice was tight with pain and effort, syllables clipped short by damaged lungs or damaged will. Requesting straighten approach, emergency declared. The tower controller nearly knocked over his coffee reaching for the transmit switch. Reaper 6, Bagram Tower, say your position and status. 20 miles northwest, Angels 4, descending. I have battle damage, both engines degraded, hydraulic failure, and I need the longest runway you have with emergency equipment standing by. Alina's voice carried no emotion, just facts delivered with the mechanical precision of someone using professionalism to hold back terror. I will make one approach. If I do not land, I will not have fuel for another. The tower controller's hand was shaking as he keyed the microphone. Reaper 6, runway 35 right is yours, winds calm, emergency equipment rolling. What is your fuel state? There was a pause, long enough that everyone listening thought the radio had died again. Then, I have enough or I don't. I will know when I get there. The lieutenant colonel was already moving, striding out of the TOC toward the flight line where he could see the approach path. Word spread through the base like electricity through wire. Reaper 6 was coming back, torn apart but still flying. Maintenance crews abandoned their work. Off-duty pilots appeared from nowhere. The squadron commander, a full colonel who had flown A-10s in Desert Storm, stood on the tower catwalk with binoculars raised, scanning the northwestern sky. Then someone saw it, a dark speck against the bright morning, trailing twin lines of black smoke that scarred the pristine air. As it grew closer, the shape became clear, and a collective intake of breath swept through everyone watching. The A-10 looked like it had flown through a shredder. The left engine cowling was partially torn away. The right horizontal stabilizer showed daylight through shrapnel holes large enough to see through, and portions of the wing skin had peeled back to expose internal structure. That it was flying at all violated physics. That it was flying straight and controlled violated belief. Alina had both hands on the stick, fighting control inputs through a hydraulic system running on fumes and faith. The manual reversion mode required physical strength to move the control surfaces, and her arms burned with the effort of keeping the aircraft level. Every breath hurt. Something broken inside, maybe ribs, maybe worse. But breathing was optional right now, and landing was not. She could see the runway in the distance, that beautiful strip of concrete that represented the difference between survival and memorial service. The aircraft wanted to roll left, physics asserting itself through damaged flight controls. She countered with right stick and opposite rudder, a constant wrestling match at 180 knots with the ground rising to meet her. The engine instruments were screaming warnings she ignored, focusing instead on airspeed, altitude, and the numbers that would let her bridge the shrinking distance between here and there. "Gear down," she said aloud to herself, reaching for the landing gear handle. The mechanical backup system engaged with a thunk she felt through the airframe, and 3 green lights illuminated after a delay that lasted forever. At least something still worked. The approach was a controlled catastrophe, each second a negotiation between what the aircraft could do and what Alina needed it to do. She crossed the runway threshold at exactly the right altitude and speed, a precision born from years of practice and days when practice had saved her life. The main wheels touched concrete with a screech of rubber, and she pulled both throttles to idle, then deployed the thrust reversers on engines that probably should not have provided any thrust at all. They rolled down the center line, slowing, finally stopping 3,000 feet down the runway, which was exactly 3,000 feet short of where the arresting barriers had been positioned. Alina sat in the cockpit for a moment, hands still on the controls, unwilling to believe she had actually landed until she saw the emergency vehicles surrounding her aircraft, the firefighters in their silver suits, the crew chief staring at the damage with expressions caught between horror and awe. She popped the canopy, and the Afghan air rushed in, hot and dusty and absolutely perfect. Her hands were shaking now that they did not need to be steady, and when she tried to unbuckle her harness, her fingers would not cooperate. Martinez appeared on the ladder beside her, his face pale under his tan, and he reached in to help with the straps without saying a word, because what was there to say about a miracle? They helped her out of the cockpit, and Alina's legs nearly buckled when her boots hit the ladder rungs. Martinez caught her, and together they descended to the concrete where a medical team was waiting with a stretcher she refused, standing on her own despite every signal her body sent suggesting that standing was no longer a viable option. She turned to look at her aircraft, really look at it in daylight, and the damage was worse than she had imagined during the flight back. The left engine showed catastrophic turbine damage visible through the mangled cowling. The right wing had taken at least 40 hits from anti-aircraft fire, some of them large enough that she could see clean through the wing structure. The vertical stabilizers were shredded, the tail section perforated like someone had used it for target practice with a machine gun. But the titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit had held, those panels designed to take hits from 23mm cannons, and they had done exactly what the engineers promised 3 decades ago when they built this aircraft. The squadron commander approached, and Alina tried to salute, but he waved it off. "Don't salute, Major. You just saved 7 Marines and brought back an aircraft that should be scattered across a valley. Medical is taking you to the hospital whether you argue or not, and then you and I are going to have a conversation about what happened up there." Alina nodded, then caught his arm as he turned away. "Sir, did the Marines make it out?" His expression softened. "All 7, because of you. Gunny Rios is already telling everyone who will listen about the crazy A-10 pilot who would not leave." Something in Alina's chest loosened. some knot of tension that had been coiled since the first tracer round had found her aircraft. The Marines were safe. Everything else was secondary to that single fact, the reason she had stayed when survival suggested leaving, the measure by which she would calculate whether today had been worth the cost. They loaded her into an ambulance, and as it pulled away from the flight line, she watched through the rear window as the maintenance crews swarmed her aircraft, already beginning the assessment that would determine if it could be repaired or if it had given everything it had in that final flight. Either way, the A-10 had earned its rest, just as Alina had earned hers. In the hospital, they x-rayed her ribs, 3 fractured from impact forces during violent maneuvering, and treated her for smoke inhalation, dehydration, and exhaustion. The flight surgeon wanted to keep her overnight for observation, but Alina refused everything except the rib wrapping and some water, because there would be a debriefing and she needed to be there, needed to explain what had happened in that valley before someone else wrote the narrative without her. The debriefing happened in a conference room with maps covering the walls, a dozen officers seated around a table, and a recording device capturing every word. Alina walked them through the mission minute by minute, describing the tactical picture, the ordnance expenditure, the moment when anti-aircraft fire transformed the situation from dangerous to catastrophic. She explained her decision to continue engaging, not as heroism but as mathematics. If she left, the Marines would be overrun before another aircraft could arrive, and 7 funerals were an unacceptable cost when her jet was still flying. They asked about the flight back, and she described it in technical terms: dual engine degradation, hydraulic system failure, manual reversion mode for flight controls, fuel calculated to arrive with fumes and hope. She did not mention the fear, or the moments when she thought the aircraft would simply come apart around her, or how she had whispered apologies to the engineers who built this machine for asking it to do the impossible. Those details did not belong in an official report. They belonged to her alone, carried in the same place she carried every other mission that had tested the boundary between courage and suicide. When the debriefing ended, the squadron commander asked her to stay. The room emptied until it was just the 2 of them, and he sat down across from her with the weight of command visible in every line of his face. "I am putting you in for the Distinguished Flying Cross," he said without preamble. "What you did today goes beyond the call of duty. Most pilots would have broken off after the first hit." Alina met his eyes steadily. "Most pilots would have been right to break off, sir. I made a calculated risk that happened to work out. If it had not, we would be having a different conversation. But it did work out, and that is what matters." He leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. "I also want you to know that you are grounded for 72 hours, medical rest, non-negotiable. After that, we will evaluate whether you are cleared to fly." She started to protest, but he raised a hand. "This is not punishment, Major. This is me making sure you heal enough to keep flying for the next decade. You are too valuable to this squadron and to the soldiers on the ground to lose because you tried to fly with fractured ribs and smoke-damaged lungs." Alina nodded slowly, recognizing that further argument would be futile and possibly insubordinate. "Yes, sir." He stood, and this time he did salute, a gesture of respect that officers rarely exchanged in private. "Get some rest, Reaper 6. The war will still be here when you are ready to come back." She returned the salute, then walked out of the conference room into the late afternoon light, where the base was going about its business with the usual controlled chaos of military operations. No one stopped to acknowledge her. No one knew what had happened except the people who had been in the TOC or on the flight line, and they were too busy with their own missions to make it a spectacle. That was fine with Alina. She had never wanted spectacle. She wanted to be useful, to matter in ways that could be measured by the people who came home, because she had been overhead when they needed her most. If that meant flying aircraft held together by hope and titanium bathtub armor, if it meant risking everything for a radio call sign she barely knew except through fire and smoke, Then that was the trade she had signed up for when she chose the A-10 and the mission that came with it. She returned to her quarters, a small room with a narrow bed and a wall locker containing her entire deployed life, and finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that had been held at bay by adrenaline and necessity. She lay down carefully, favoring her ribs, and stared at the ceiling while the day replayed in fragments behind her eyes. The valley, the Marines, the guns, the impossible flight home. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless, the sleep of someone who had spent everything and had nothing left to give until rest replenished the account. Outside her window, the sun set over the mountains, and somewhere in a medical tent, 7 Marines were being checked over by corpsmen, alive because an A-10 pilot named Alina Kovac had decided that their survival was worth more than her safety, and had backed that decision with skill, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept any outcome except the one where everyone came home. 3 days later, Alina returned to flight status. The flight surgeon cleared her with restrictions: no hygiene maneuvering for 2 weeks, no extended missions beyond 4 hours, but cleared nonetheless. Her aircraft, however, was grounded indefinitely. The maintenance assessment had revealed damage so extensive that repair was technically possible but economically questionable. The A-10 had given everything in that valley, and like any warrior pushed past breaking, it needed time to heal or permission to rest forever. They assigned Alina a different aircraft, tail number 638, an A-10C with only moderate combat time and systems that worked the way the technical manuals promised. She flew it on a training sortie to requalify, and the aircraft handled beautifully, responsive and solid, everything her damaged bird had not been during that final flight. It was better in every measurable way, but it was not hers, and she missed the battle-scarred jet that had brought her home against all probability. Word about the mission had spread beyond the squadron. Gunny Rios had filed his own report, and the Marine chain of command had sent a commendation that specifically named Reaper 6 as the reason his team had survived. Other ground units began requesting her by call sign, trusting the legend more than the reality, expecting miracles from someone who simply showed up and did the job with as much skill as training and experience allowed. Alina felt the weight of those expectations every time she launched, the knowledge that somewhere below, soldiers believed she would save them because that is what she had done before. It was unfair pressure, built on a single mission where luck had been as important as skill, but she carried it anyway because the alternative was to tell them the truth, that she was just a pilot who refused to quit, and sometimes refusal was enough, but sometimes it was just dying slower. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony happened on a Tuesday morning, with the squadron formed up on the flight line and a visiting general pinning the medal to her uniform, while a photographer captured the moment for official records. Alina stood at attention, uncomfortable with the attention, wishing this could have been done privately so it would feel less like performance and more like acknowledgement. The general said words about valor and selfless service, phrases that sounded impressive but felt hollow because they did not capture the real texture of that day. The fear, the calculations, the moment when training replaced thinking and muscle memory became survival. When it ended, pilots lined up to shake her hand, many of them F-16 and F-15 drivers who had previously treated the A-10 community with polite condescension, as if close air support was a lesser calling compared to air superiority and deep strike. Now they looked at her differently, with something that might have been respect, or might have been the awareness that courage was not exclusive to fast jets, and that dying slowly at 400 feet was no less difficult than dying quickly at 40,000. The squadron threw a small party that night, in the way deployed units celebrated when alcohol was prohibited, and entertainment was limited to terrible movies and worse card games. Someone produced a cake from the dining facility, and they sang off-key while Alina cut it with a borrowed knife, and for a few hours the war receded enough that they could pretend they were just people working an unusual job in an unusual place. Later, alone in her quarters, Alina looked at the medal in its presentation case and felt nothing except tired. It was a piece of ribbon and metal, recognition from a system that needed symbols to make sense of chaos. What mattered was not in the case. It was in the fact that 7 Marines had walked out of that valley, that Gunny Rios had sent her a handwritten note saying simply, "Thank you for not leaving us," and that somewhere in the maintenance hangar, her battered A-10 sat waiting to see if it would fly again, or if its service had ended in the moment it touched down on that runway with nothing left to give. She placed the metal case in her wall locker, closed the door, and returned to the routine of deployed life: mission briefs, flight planning, simulator training to stay sharp. The war continued its grinding rhythm, and she flew missions supporting ground units who would never know her name but who benefited from her presence overhead, the reassuring growl of turbofan engines, and the promise that if things went wrong, someone would stay until they went right again. A month after the Valley mission, maintenance declared her original aircraft beyond economical repair. Too many systems damaged, too many structural components compromised, the cost of restoration exceeding the value of keeping one more A-10 in the inventory when the Air Force was already planning to retire the fleet. They would salvage parts and scrap the rest, a pragmatic decision that made financial sense and broke the hearts of everyone who understood what that particular airframe had accomplished. Alina requested permission to see it one last time before the salvage team began disassembly. She walked into the maintenance hangar where the A-10 sat in the back corner, surrounded by newer aircraft receiving routine service, a forgotten warrior in a space dedicated to the currently useful. Up close, the battle damage was even more shocking. Whole sections of wing and tail that looked like they had been attacked with hammers and rage. Control surfaces that should not have provided any control at all. Engine components held together by sheer refusal to disintegrate. She placed her hand on the fuselage, cold metal under her palm, and silently thanked the engineers who had built this machine to absorb punishment, the designers who had armored the cockpit and made redundancy a religion, and the unnamed crew chiefs across 3 decades who had maintained this airframe, so that when one pilot asked for the impossible, the aircraft had enough left to deliver it. The A-10 could not hear her gratitude, but she gave it anyway, because some debts could only be paid in words spoken to an empty hangar when no one was watching. Martinez found her there an hour later, standing in front of the aircraft with her hand still resting on the fuselage like she was saying goodbye to something that had earned more than industrial salvage. "They are starting disassembly tomorrow," he said quietly. "I thought you should know." Alina nodded without turning. "It deserves better than this." "It deserves a museum," Martinez agreed. "But museums are for aircraft that died famous, and this one just did its job. That is not enough for the historians." "It should be." Alina finally pulled her hand away. "Doing your job when your job is impossible, that should be exactly enough." They stood together in silence. 2 people who understood that the real heroes never got parades. They got salvaged for parts and forgotten by everyone except the few who had been there when it mattered. Then Alina turned and walked out of the hangar, back into sunlight, and the ongoing demands of a deployment that would not pause for sentiment, leaving behind the aircraft that had saved her life and the lives of 7 Marines by refusing to quit even when quitting was the only rational choice. Years would pass before she learned what happened to the salvaged parts, scattered across the remaining A-10 fleet, pieces of her bird keeping other aircraft flying, a distributed immortality that was somehow perfect for a machine that had never sought glory, only utility. The deployment ended 3 months later, and Alina rotated back to the United States with her squadron, trading the brown mountains of Afghanistan for the green flatlands of Arizona and Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, where the A-10 community had made its institutional home. She returned to a routine that felt both familiar and strange, flying training missions against simulated targets, teaching younger pilots how to employ weapons they would hopefully never need in combat, and trying to explain what it felt like to make decisions where every choice carried the weight of someone else's survival. The Distinguished Flying Cross went on her uniform, another ribbon among the rows that marked deployments and campaigns and years of service. People who did not know her would see it and make assumptions about heroism and fearlessness, missing the reality that courage was mostly just showing up and doing the work even when the work was terrifying. She did not correct those assumptions. Let them believe whatever narrative helped them make sense of a world where sometimes the right choice was to fly toward the guns instead of away from them. She was promoted to lieutenant colonel 2 years later, a recognition of time served and competence demonstrated, moving from line pilot to operations officer with administrative duties that kept her in the squadron, but away from the cockpit more often than she liked. The Air Force was slowly phasing out the A-10 political decisions from people who had never needed close air support, arguing that the aircraft was obsolete and too expensive to maintain. Alina fought those decisions in meetings and memos, knowing she would probably lose but refusing to surrender without making the case that some capabilities could not be measured in cost-benefit analyses. She trained the next generation of A-10 pilots, teaching them weapons employment and tactical procedures, but also the intangibles that made the difference between competent and exceptional. How to read the battlefield from 400 feet, how to communicate with ground controllers whose voices carried the texture of fear, how to manage fuel and ammunition, and risk in calculations that happened at 200 knots with someone's life hanging on the answer. Some of them would deploy and find themselves in situations where the training mattered, where the muscle memory she had drilled into them would operate faster than conscious thought and give them the extra second needed to make the right decision. They would come back and thank her, not understanding that she was just passing forward what others had taught her, a chain of knowledge extending back through decades of pilots who had learned the same lessons in the same ways and had survived long enough to share them. On quiet days, when the flight line was empty and the Arizona sun turned the concrete into shimmering heat mirages, Alina would walk past the rows of parked A-10s and remember the valley, the Marines, the impossible flight home. The memory had softened with time, edges worn smooth by retelling and distance, but the core remained sharp. The weight of that decision to stay, the physical sensation of fighting a dying aircraft through manual controls, the moment when the runway appeared ahead and landing changed from theoretical to possible. She had been asked to speak about it at various events, panels on women in combat aviation or symposiums on close air support, and she always declined. The story was not hers to commodify. It belonged to the Marines who had lived because she stayed, to the A-10 that had died bringing her home, to the hundreds of other pilots who made similar choices on different days in different valleys, and whose sacrifices never made it into medal citations or documentary films. What she would never tell anyone was that sometimes, late at night when sleep was difficult and memory was vivid, she wondered if she had been brave or just stubborn, if the decision to continue engaging had been tactical wisdom or reckless pride. The question had no answer, or it had too many answers depending on which moment you examined and which outcome you measured, and so she carried the uncertainty the same way she carried everything else, as weight distributed across years, manageable in small doses, crushing if she tried to lift it all at once. The Air Force finally retired the A-10 from combat operations when Alina was a full colonel, a final decision from leadership who believed the future belonged to stealth and standoff weapons, not low-altitude gun runs and danger-close ordnance. She attended the ceremony where the last combat-coded squadron furled its colors, and she watched pilots younger than her cry openly for an aircraft that had kept them alive and soldiers safe, mourning a capability the institution had decided it could afford to lose. Alina did not cry. She had used her tears years ago in a hospital room after the Valley mission, private grief for an aircraft that had earned better than salvage. Instead, she stood at attention while they played taps and folded the squadron flag, and she saluted when protocol demanded, and she walked away knowing that some decisions were irreversible and some capabilities, once lost, could never be rebuilt no matter how many conferences and studies later proved the decision had been wrong. She retired from the Air Force 2 years after that, 25 years of service condensed into a ceremony, a plaque, and a pension. They offered her positions in defense contracting and consulting, opportunities to leverage her experience into corporate dollars, but she declined them all. She had spent a quarter-century making life and death decisions, and she was finished with rooms where profit margins mattered more than the soldiers on the ground who would pay the cost of bad equipment or inadequate support. Instead, she moved to Colorado and bought a small house with a view of mountains that reminded her of Afghanistan, but without the war attached to the landscape. She took a teaching position at a community college, instructing aviation mechanics and sharing the technical knowledge she had accumulated across 24 aircraft types and 100 maintenance crises. The students did not know about the medals or the missions. They knew her as Professor Kovach, strict but fair, someone who expected precision and rewarded competence and had no patience for shortcuts that endangered safety. It was quiet work, important in ways that would never make headlines, teaching the people who would keep aircraft flying safely for decades after she was gone. She liked the rhythm of semesters and summers, the clean problems of systems and structures, the satisfaction of watching students master difficult concepts and walk away with skills that would carry them through careers she would never see. Sometimes former military pilots would recognize her name and ask if she was the Alina Kovach from the Valley mission, and she would confirm it briefly without elaboration, offering no stories or insights beyond what was already public record. The past was the past, and she had learned that carrying it lightly was the only way to carry it at all without being crushed by the accumulated weight of every decision and consequence and life saved or lost in fractions of seconds and feet. Years passed. The A-10 became a museum piece, examples preserved at aviation centers where children could climb on the aircraft and imagine what it had been like to fly into combat in something so ungainly and lethal. Alina visited one such museum with her sister's family, watching her nephew explore the cockpit while a placard explained the A-10's history and capabilities in text that felt simultaneously accurate and incomplete, capturing facts while missing the texture that made those facts meaningful. They walked past a particular aircraft, tail number 820638, and Alina stopped abruptly. Her sister noticed the pause and asked if something was wrong, and Alina shook her head while staring at the battered fuselage, recognition hitting with physical force. This was not her original aircraft. That one had been scrapped. But it had been her assigned bird during the final year of that deployment, the replacement jet that had flown well but never felt quite right because it lacked the battle scars that proved reliability under fire. She stood there for longer than was reasonable, studying the aircraft from angles that revealed maintenance access panels and structural repair points visible only to someone who had spent hours in pre-flight inspections. The museum had restored it to pristine condition, erasing the combat patina that had marked every deployed A-10, making it beautiful in a way that felt false because beauty had never been the aircraft's purpose. Function was the purpose. Survival was the purpose. Bringing everyone home was the purpose that justified the ugly design, and the low speed, and the vulnerability that made every mission a calculated risk. Her nephew ran up with questions about weapons and speed, and Alina answered them patiently, translating military specifications into terms a 10-year-old could understand, explaining that the A-10 had never been fast or sleek, but had been exactly what it needed to be when soldiers were in danger and options were limited. The boy listened with the solemn attention children reserved for adults they respected, then asked if she had ever flown one. Yes, Alina said simply, for a long time. Was it scary? He asked. Alina considered the question, weighing honesty against the need to avoid traumatizing a child at a museum. Sometimes, she admitted, but scary is not the same as wrong. Sometimes the right thing is scary, and you do it anyway because people are counting on you. The boy nodded as if this made perfect sense, then ran off to examine the landing gear, satisfied with an answer that contained truth without unnecessary complexity. Alina watched him go, then took one last look at the A-10 before following her family toward the exit, carrying with her the knowledge that somewhere in a scrapyard or distributed across a fleet or preserved in museums, pieces of the aircraft that saved her life still existed, silent witnesses to a day when everything had gone wrong and somehow, impossibly, everyone had made it home anyway. She thought about the Marines sometimes, wondering if they still remembered or if the valley had faded into the general background of deployment memories, one emergency among many. She hoped they had gone on to live full lives, that the hours she bought them had multiplied into years and decades, grandchildren who existed because their grandfather had not died in an Afghan valley when an A-10 pilot decided his survival mattered more than her safety. There was no way to measure that kind of impact, no equation that could calculate the value of life saved versus risk accepted. It existed in the negative space of history, the things that did not happen because someone chose differently, the funerals that never occurred, and the families that stayed whole and the children who grew up with fathers, because a pilot none of them would ever meet had stayed on station, when leaving would have been justified and reasonable and safe. Alina Kovac carried that knowledge the way she carried everything else from those years, quietly, without need for recognition, accepting that some accounts could never be balanced and some debts could never be paid except through the simple act of continuing forward, living the life that had been preserved through luck and skill, and the stubborn refusal of both pilot and aircraft to accept defeat while alternatives remained. The sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the snow peaks in colors that reminded her of sunrise over the Hindu Kush, and she stood on her porch watching the light fade, a retired colonel in her late 40s who had once been a scared pilot fighting a dying aircraft through impossible circumstances, and who had somehow emerged from that crucible with life intact and conscience clear, ready for whatever quiet years remained, knowing that when the final accounting came, she had been useful, she had mattered. And sometimes that was more than enough, it was everything.